First of all, many thanks for the invitation to be here today. It's really an honor and a privilege for me to be discussing such important issues. My presentation today will present the research that we are leading at NOVA School of Law, which focuses on the role of law in fostering sustainable business conduct. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown some light on the difficulties that comes from unregulated supply chains. The regulation of corporate behavior today, more than ever, is crucial in attaining development, the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is where the research that we are undertaking at NOVA School of Law is making a difference. If we look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, in the preamble, we can see that the 17 goals and 169 targets seek to realize the human rights of all. So when we speak about human rights, we're really talking about all the developmental goals, even the ones that relate to environmental protection, because environmental harms have impacts on our human rights, and the right to a healthy environment is a human right itself. Now, the preamble also tells us that the sustainable goals are integrated and indivisible and balance the three dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, the social, and the environmental. These three dimensions are three dimensions in which companies play a crucial role. Companies can have positive impacts on society and the environment. They can, of course, contribute to countries' economic growth and development by creating jobs, transferring skills, and thereby contributing to the realization of sustainable development goals. But a lot of well-documented case studies have also shown that companies can and do have adverse impacts on both human rights and the environment through their own activities and throughout their supply chains. Now let me just give you a few examples. Most of us love chocolate. Chocolate is a product of cocoa beans. 70% of the world's cocoa beans are grown and harvested in Western African countries, and in particular in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. In these countries, studies estimate that 1.2 million children, that's for Côte d'Ivoire, and 0.9 million children in Ghana work in child labor in cocoa farms that supply chocolate companies. So the question which arises is really, what regulatory reforms are necessary to ensure that the cocoa beans that chocolate companies source are not the fruit of child labor? Another example here, according to the International Labour Organization, 16 million people are trapped in forced labor in the private sector. For instance, 1 out of 5 of the cotton clothes that we wear originate from factories in China, which uses forced labor from the Uyghur people. Again, here the question is, what is the role of law in making sure that companies are not sourcing their products from places which are tainted with forced labor? These are just a few examples amongst many others which show how companies can and do affect the social dimension of sustainable development. In other words, human rights. But let us also look at the environmental dimension here. According to a report by the UN Special Rapporteur Philip Alston that was released in June 2019, fossil fuel companies are the main drivers for climate change. They account for 91% of global industrial greenhouse emissions and 70% of all human-made emissions. So again, the question arises as to how to regulate companies to make sure that they mitigate their climate-related impacts. It is clear from these examples that companies have a key role to play in sustainable development, and now has never been a more critical time to place human rights and environmental considerations at the forefront of business practices and business decisions. Now let me give you a little bit of an overview of the legal landscape. At the international level, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were unanimously adopted by the Human Rights Council in June 2011. They constitute the first globally accepted framework in the field and rest around three pillars: the state duty to protect human rights, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and access to remedy for affected individuals. Now, looking more specifically at the second pillar, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. The guiding principles tell us that in order to meet their responsibility to respect human rights, business enterprises should have in place a process which is called the human rights due diligence process, which is a process whereby they can identify, prevent, mitigate, and address the human rights impacts that arise out of their activities and of their supply chains. There are four core components of the due diligence process: the necessity to assess the actual and potential impacts that they are having. Once they have assessed these impacts, the integration of these findings and what are they going to do to address them. Then the tracking of the effectiveness of their responses. And finally, the communication and how they address those impacts. The due diligence process is a global norm of expected conduct which reflects social expectations of businesses. It is not, however, a legally binding obligation. In fact, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which I just presented, are what we call a soft law instrument. As their name suggests, they're guiding principles, they're recommendations, they're not legally binding. And there is no international instrument at the moment that make it compulsory, that imposes a legal duty on companies to ensure that they do not infringe human rights or the environment in their activities or throughout their supply chain. This is what we call the regulatory gap. What we see instead is a lot of voluntary initiatives, a lot of soft law regulations, which are not legally binding. At the beginning of this year, we published a report that we prepared for the European Commission, which analyzed corporate behavior in Europe, in particular through a survey for which we received over 600 responses, through 50 interviews that we undertook with various stakeholders throughout Europe, companies, NGOs, trade unions, academics, businesses, business organizations, etc., and 10 company case studies. In our report, we highlighted the limitations of those voluntary initiatives and soft law regulations in terms of fostering sustainable business conduct. Our study showed that just over 1/3 of business respondents undertook, or over 1/3 of companies in Europe undertake human rights or environmental due diligence in relation to their activities. At the international level, we can observe similar levels of law compliance with soft law regulations. So if we look, for instance, at 2019 results of the corporate human rights benchmark assessment, this is an assessment that looked at the top 200 of the largest companies in the world. And the assessment found that out of these 200 companies, half of them scored 0 on every indicator of the human rights due diligence process. So in other words, half of the 200 biggest companies in the world do not have any process in place to identify, prevent, and address their adverse human rights and environmental impacts. On the basis of these findings, we explored the various regulatory options which could be adopted at the EU level. And we describe them in our report for the European Commission. Recently, we have been seeing a lot of legislative initiatives at the domestic level. For instance, in my country of origin, France, the first law in the world was adopted that actually requires companies, large French companies, to be more specific, to undertake human rights and environmental due diligence in their activities and throughout their supply chains. So in our reports, we analyzed these different legislations and those different legislative initiatives, their strengths and weaknesses, and we proposed solutions for regulatory intervention at the EU level. In April 2020, EU Commissioner for Justice, Didier Reynders, presented the findings of our study to the European Parliament. And on the basis of the findings, he announced that the European Commission committed to introducing a legislative initiatives on these issues as part of the recovery package post-COVID-19 in 2021. So in other words, in 2021, there will be in Europe a legislative initiatives that would aim to make it compulsory for companies in Europe to undertake human rights and environmental due diligence in relation to their activities and supply chains. So this is one example of the research that we are doing here at NOVA School of Law. Another example where the research that we are doing is contributing to responsible business conduct, also outside of the EU level, but looking more at the international level. At the moment, there are negotiations ongoing for a treaty on business and human rights. A few months ago, we organized a European consultation on the treaty, in which NOVA School of Law took part, and wrote recommendations that were then fed to the working group at the UN that is drafting the treaty. In the coming week, we will be opening a new knowledge center on business, human rights, and the environment, with 3 objectives: to foster multidisciplinary and collaborative research on sustainable business practices, to develop awareness and capacity building around these issues through trainings and courses. We have already developed a webinar series which looked at the business and human rights development in Southern Europe. We had our first episode last week which focused on Portugal. Portugal is also a very good example. The first national survey on business and human rights was published last year in December 2019. It looked at Portuguese companies. The majority of large Portuguese companies were found in the survey not to undertake human rights and environmental due diligence. But interestingly, if we look at small and medium companies, which are the majority of companies in Portugal, the number goes down to below 20%. So below 20% of small and medium companies in Portugal have processes in place to identify, prevent, and address their human rights and environmental impacts. So you can see that there is a lot of work here to be done in terms of capacity building, in case of raising awareness amongst Portuguese companies, as well as amongst European and international companies. The third pillar, which is related of our center, will be to create an observatory of the practices of Portuguese companies in relation to human rights and the environment. The center will also keep pushing for regulatory reform to further foster sustainable business conduct. And this is it for the for the overview of the work we are doing at NOVA School of Law on these issues. Thank you.